Hello listeners, this is the second talk in response to Jacob Moore and Millennial Woes. Jacob Moore wanted to know what I would invest in other than businesses, and Millennial Woes wanted to know about what to do with money in general, different amounts of money. So I hope this talk will answer their inquiries and also be useful to other people. So I'm going to assume that you've listened to the first talk and implemented some of the ideas there as far as possible. And you've built up a little bit of money at this point, perhaps $1,000, something like that. And you're wondering what to begin to do now, once you've covered all those really basic things. So the first thing I would actually suggest before even beginning to invest money, before going on the offense, is to continue to sort out the defense. So what I would suggest there is to build an emergency fund. And I think there are two ways you can go about this, essentially. I mean, there are more, but I'm going to offer you two. And the first one is that I would build up approximately 6 months worth of living expenses. Now, I don't know what your living expenses are. You obviously can calculate those yourself. It will also depend on where you live and all of that sort of stuff. There's an indication. There's a fairly popular personal finance blog called Mr. Money Moustache. I haven't been there in a few years, but when I went there a few years ago, I remember him discussing that he and his family lived off $28,000 per year, which is a little under $2,500 per month. Now they own a house. They own their house, so they don't pay a mortgage or rent on that. They seem to have a fairly reasonable lifestyle. They're careful with their money, but it's more that they're smart with their money rather than having to be ridiculously frugal. But nevertheless, the three of them live off approximately $2,500 per month. And if I remember correctly, they live in or around Denver, Colorado, I believe. So the first option, I think, is to build up 6 months worth of living expenses, as I said. So that's probably going to be at least $15,000 for many people. It could be well over that even. But I think it's very important to have an emergency fund, because one of the things I discussed in the first talk was that frequently poor people can really be knocked around by crises that may emerge. So you want to have that defense covered so that you're not going to be knocked around by those kinds of things, because it's very important to be psychologically stable and comfortable and so on, have peace of mind before you think about investing and going on the offense. Otherwise, you're going to make irrational decisions based upon either greed or fear. The second option is to be slightly more aggressive than in the first option. And I would suggest this would be an option for people who are younger, single, don't have responsibilities, can pack up and move quite easily, and have more freedom generally with the options that they have available. So what I would suggest for these people is perhaps only build up a couple of months worth of emergency funds initially. It's still good to have at least a couple of months, so perhaps $5,000, but a couple of months worth of emergency funds. Again, simply to cover things that may happen in life, losing a job and so on. That may be easier to get over if you're single, young, all that kind of stuff. Harder, of course, if you're older and have a family and so on, which is why I suggested 6 months for those people. But what I would do is build up a couple of months worth of emergency funds and, say approximately $5,000 or so. And then with additional money after that, I would split it between continuing to build that emergency fund up to the full 6 months and then beginning to invest that money. You can be slightly more aggressive when you're younger and single and so on. So in terms of investing, what would I do there? Well, this is an enormous topic, and it's actually taken me multiple attempts to make this talk, to try to think about how I could make this complex enough that it would offer useful information, but not so complex that it would completely overwhelm people who don't know much about this topic. And there's a lot of stuff to be said, and I can't really say it all in one talk. It would take hours and hours to really cover it all. I may cover particular topics more in the future, but this is really just going to be an overview. The first thing I would say is don't do anything you don't understand. That's a very important point, because if you don't do things you don't understand, you very much run the risk of losing money, of doing your shirt essentially. So either just don't do things that you don't understand, or learn about them and then do them. But either way, don't just rush into them blindly. So, of course, that may entail having to become financially literate. Some of the listeners to this talk may already have quite good financial literacy. Others may have next to none. So I don't know, that will depend upon you. But assuming you don't really know very much about economics and finance, I would suggest you just get your hands on anything and everything you can. So read a lot online, go to the library and borrow books, watch YouTube videos, all of that sort of stuff. And there are tons and tons of resources out there. A really good one, and I'll put this below the talk, is investopedia.com. They have newsletters. You can sign up for weekly newsletters or multiple newsletters that get sent to your email, and each week covers different topics and articles written by contributors to that website. And then you can go to the website and look for particular topics. You can do a search for particular topics, and they have tutorials on sort of basic concepts and topics within investing and so on. And another really good thing they have on that website actually is a glossary of terms. And everything's explained very simply. It's very much aimed at the layperson. So that's a really good resource. I've read a lot of things from that website. I did in gaining financial literacy myself. And of course there are lots of other websites. You'll be able to find them if you just start searching for these things. A particular thing I would really learn about, because this is something I'm going to talk about in this talk, is something called an ETF. ETF stands for Exchange Traded Fund. Now, there are different types of ETFs. Some of them are actively managed, but essentially what they do, they're passive, generally speaking. They track an index. Now, an index is kind of a subsection of the stock market. So if you take a particular stock exchange, it might be, an index might be a subsection based upon the size of the companies. So companies that are very large or companies that are very small, or it could be based upon sectors. So it could be a subsection that only includes technology companies, for instance, or it might only include mining companies or something like that. So that's basically what an index is. It just it has a whole lot of companies that have something in common, and they're grouped together, and you can buy things that basically track that essentially own a little piece of each of the companies on that index. And you don't really have to do anything. You just buy that thing that tracks it, and you buy it or sell it whenever you want. And ETFs are a way of tracking various indices. You don't really have to do anything with the ETFs. You just buy them, you just sell them. That's pretty much it. And one of the major attractions to ETFs is the low fee structure involved. They're much cheaper than most other things. So I would suggest reading about ETFs, and I'll put a couple of links below about ETFs. And then some other stuff that I would suggest reading, which these things may or may not be your cup of tea, but they've very much influenced how I think about investing and also about business. So I think they're worth reading. And there are three things here. The first one is the letters from Warren Buffett to the shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway. You've probably heard of Warren Buffett. He's a very famous investor, very successful. arguably the greatest investor in history. And he runs a company called Berkshire Hathaway, and that's what's known as a holding company. They hold or own many other smaller companies or pieces or parts of other companies. And they have a huge range of companies in all sorts of industries. They have everything from candy to clothing, railways, insurance, all of this sort of stuff. I mean, it's huge. Furniture companies, there's all sorts of stuff that they own, and parts of other companies, so Coca-Cola, for instance, American Express. So they do a lot of different stuff, basically, in that company, or rather other people do for them, and he just sort of oversees the whole thing and decides when to buy and sell and how to allocate capital and so on. But nevertheless, he writes a letter every year to the shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway, talking about what has happened in the past year in that company, and also he looks at decisions he made in the past, a couple of years ago or 5 years ago, and he analyses those to see how successful they've been. Now, why is it really good to read these letters? Basically because he's a very smart person. He's very successful at what he does, and he not only discusses very particular things, but also investing philosophy in general. So you get a real insight into how he thinks. And of course, those analyses he does of previous decisions, and he can be quite critical of himself when he doesn't do well. You get someone's thoughts on the page, a very smart person's thoughts on the page, and he's been writing those for decades. I'll put a link to those letters below, and they go back to 1977. So approximately 4 decades worth of his thoughts, essentially. You can see the evolution of his thoughts and so on. So they're very useful, and they're written in very simple terms, pardon me, because the average shareholder of Berkshire Hathaway is not a financial industry guru. It's just an average person. So they're very easy to read. Of course, given that there are 40 of them, and they are quite long, they take some time to read. There's a lot of reading there. There's probably 100 hours worth of reading, I'd say. But it's worth doing that. Whatever you do in terms of gaining financial literacy, you're going to have to put time in. It's going to take months, if not years, to fully develop financial literacy. There's no shortcut, basically. All right, the next particular suggestion I would have is to read a book called The Intelligent Investor. It's about 640 pages long, so it is quite long. It's fairly easy to read. You'll need to have some basic financial literacy, but nevertheless, it's fairly easy to read, and it goes into a whole lot of investing philosophy, essentially. And it's considered to be the Bible of investing. It's highly recommended by all sorts of people, and it's been extremely influential. And indeed, there's a connection between that and Warren Buffett, because the person who wrote The Intelligent Investor, someone called Benjamin Graham, was Warren Buffett's teacher. And that man, Benjamin Graham, was very influential upon Warren Buffett, and indeed Warren Buffett worked for him for a while after studying under him. Benjamin Graham's book and his teaching as well, those things have been very influential upon a number of other very successful investors. Some of them the same age as Warren Buffett, and many younger. It's cross-generational. So that's a very good book to read. Another book that's very much worth reading, again by another person in that league. All of these people are considered to be value investors. That's the school of investing that they belong to, and I also subscribe to that way of thinking about investing. Another person who is a value investor is a man called Joel Greenblatt, and he wrote a book called The Little Book That Beats the Market, and there's a sort of an updated version called The Little Book That Still Beats the Market. You can find these books online as PDFs, or you can buy them. I'm only going to put links to the books themselves on the official books that you can buy from Amazon. But nevertheless, you can actually find these online. Now, this book, it's a very short book. It's only 208 pages, and it's a very easy read. It's written in very simple language, so you can absolutely tear through this. I finished it in an afternoon and an evening. in 2 sittings. And it's very useful because, again, it goes into the whole philosophy of value investing. And then it also offers some very practical advice, something he calls calls magic formula investing. And he also has some online tools for following that system of investing that he has created. So it's very useful. It has some very practical information that you can apply as well. And Joel Greenblatt, he's an academic, but he's also been very successful as a money manager. In 10 years, when he was running a fund, he had annual returns of over 50%, which is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, at 50%, your portfolio is basically doubling in a little over a year. 1.5 years pretty much. Every 1.5 years it doubles. So, it will double 6 times in a decade. So what's that? That's 64 times. So if you had $1,000 with him at the start, and then after 10 years, you would have had $6,400. $64,000, which is phenomenal. So Joel Greenblatt is very much worth listening to or reading. All right, now, in terms of investing generally, there are 3 broad approaches you could take to this issue of what to do with your money, with your $1,000 or more. So I'll just mention the 3 systems, and then I'll get into more detail about each, the pros and cons and so on. The first approach you could take is to follow a system. And there are many different systems that have been devised. So, for instance, one that's been devised by Joel Greenblatt in that book that I just mentioned. There's another one that's been mentioned a couple of times in comments beneath my previous video, and that's a system devised by Harry Brown. And there are lots of other systems as well. The second approach is you could let someone else manage your money. And the third approach is that you could take a very active role in managing your own money, more than just using a simple system, a formula, basically. So let's look at each of these in turn. The first one, following a system, as I said, there are tons of different systems, but generally speaking, they tend to follow a pretty simple approach. What they do is they essentially say, all right, you put this much of your portfolio, so this percentage of your portfolio in this kind of thing, this other percentage in this other kind of thing, and so on. And they just divvy it up like that. And it's pretty simple to follow, basically. All right, so the pros and cons. Well, the first pro is, as I said, it's simple to use. It's easy to use. It doesn't take a genius to use these systems usually. The second pro is that following a system usually involves very little time. Usually you look at it once a year, maybe more frequently, maybe once every 6 months or 3 months, but usually once a year. You spend a couple of hours just making a few little adjustments, selling this, buying that, and then you basically leave it, you forget it, you come back to it again in the future. And the third pro is they can frequently have low fees, especially if you end up buying ETFs, which is something I'll suggest later on. So low fees are good because there are essentially 2 types of fees when you invest. Basically, there are transaction costs, and then there are fees you have to pay to someone else, someone who might be managing your money. And if you're invested in any kind of fund, even if you're following a system, you'll still have to pay fees to the people who run that fund, even if they're not doing a lot. So these systems generally tend to have lower fees than other things because they're not so actively managed. Now, the cons, the con really with this kind of thing is that it's very formulaic, and as such, you're going to get, generally speaking, not always, you'll tend to get quite average returns. That's not the case with Joel Greenblatt's system. Supposedly, he's returned over 30%, or you would have got over 30% annual returns by following his system. But generally speaking, these systems, a formulaic approach, will tend to yield pretty average returns minus, and then you have to take out your fees as well. So you're not going to make tons of money, though you probably also won't lose much money either. They're pretty middle of the road. All right, the second approach is you could let someone else manage your money. And this is actually in some ways more complex than the previous one. So the pros, you can get very good returns, but of course that's very much dependent upon the manager and getting a good manager. Of course, you can also get bad returns, but potentially you have the opportunity to make much better returns than if you just use a very formulaic system. Another pro is, and this probably won't really be too important to many people here, but nevertheless, another pro is that they can be more tailored to your personal needs. So if you have a peculiar situation, if you're trying to set something up for an inheritance or leaving money to a charity or something like that, or you have particular upcoming needs, you can tailor these things much more than you would with just some sort of generic formulaic approach to investing. But as I said, that's probably not really going to be too relevant to anyone here at this point. It tends to be for people who have a lot of money, really, those kinds of issues. Now, the cons for letting someone else manage your money. The first one is actually getting someone who knows what he's doing, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, because if these people were simply everywhere, then everyone would get them, and by definition, those people wouldn't get exceptional returns. But nevertheless, you can find them. As I mentioned before, Joel Greenblatt got annual returns of 50% for 10 years, and before he closed the fund that he was running. And likewise, there's another person called Peter Lynch. He got 29% returns for 13 years running the Magellan Fund before he left that as well. So some of these guys can do really well. If like Peter Lynch getting 29% returns, basically money is doubling in a little under 3 years. In that case, so after a decade, you're probably looking at 8 to 10 times what you began the decade with. So, that's very good also. But as I said, it can be difficult finding someone who knows what he's doing. And you really have to understand what they're on about. So it does require a certain level of financial literacy in order to do this, because you have to be able to ask them the right questions and sort of get inside their heads a little bit. And following on from that, you need to both be on the same wavelength philosophically and even in terms of personality. You need to understand that you're hiring a professional to some extent, and you can't micromanage that person, because that's actually going to sort of cramp their style to some extent. If you can't just let go and let them do what they want to do, then you probably shouldn't have someone else managing your money. It's going to be bad for both of you in that situation. You have to understand you're building a long-term relationship, and there's a certain level of faith involved in just letting that person do their thing. So, of course, as I said, those kinds of things require you to have more knowledge and insight and so on. And why would you do that? It might be because either they could just get better returns than you could, or you might not have the time to do what they do. It is a very involved process, managing money. So you might decide that they could do it better than you, and you just don't have the time to do it. That's actually the case with me. I have someone else managing my money for that reason. I started getting into all of this, and I won't go into the whole story about how I met this guy, but it was sort of it was through a friend, but it was very coincidental how I met this guy. And I found that we were both very much on the same page philosophically. And I realized that he was actually very good. He was probably going to do much better than I could. So, I didn't, money was more important than my ego. So I said, all right, well, this guy's smarter than me, so I'll let him do it. And it involves a massive amount of time for him, and I sort of figured out I actually don't really want to spend that amount of time. So I have him, and he's doing quite well, and I'm very happy with that. But he does have some people who always try to micromanage him, and I know it's frustrating for him, because he gave me a big spiel when I first met him about how he actually didn't want to manage my money unless I was really on board with what he was going to do. And he gives that spiel to everyone, but then he still gets these people who say, okay, that's great, I trust you and so on. And then they come back and try to micromanage him later on, which is very frustrating. But anyway, so that's what I've done basically. Now, back to the cons for this approach of letting other people manage your money. They can have very high fees, managed funds. And what you should try to do there is two things. You should firstly try to have it geared more towards performance fees rather than management fees. The reason for that is that if you have management fees, you pay those regardless of what happens to your money. If it goes up, you pay the fee. If it goes down, you pay the fee. And the incentives of that person are not necessarily aligned with yours. They tend to be more short-term. They want to look flashy for a while so they can attract more money to their fund. But they may not necessarily have your best interests at heart. Whereas if they're paid a performance fee, it's very much in their interest to perform well over the long term, not to take any shortcuts, basically. So you want things geared more towards performance fees rather than management fees. And you may end up paying a lot in those performance fees, but basically if you pay a lot, that's because they're making you a lot, so it's well worth doing that. It's a bit like many years ago, my father told me that when he had salesmen working for him, he always used to say to them that he hoped he had to pay them a lot of money in commission, because by doing that would have meant that they were making him a lot of money. So you have to think of it positively in that regard. Now, following on from that, in terms of aligning their interests and your interests, if possible, you want to make sure they have skin in the game. Now, what does that mean? That basically means that they're invested in the things that you're invested in. Because, again, if you make money, they make money. If you lose money, they lose money. So you want to make sure that they're trying to do what's best for you. You know, a lot of CEOs in big companies, their compensation packages are not necessarily aligned with the interests of the shareholders. And so, you know, they get these golden parachutes and so on, even if the shareholders have taken a bath. You don't want to be in that situation. You very much want this guy to have the majority of his own investments in the same thing that he has your money in, so that your fortunes rise or fall together. All right, now, additional cons. The last thing is that these funds, it depends upon the fund, but many of them have high minimum capital requirements. So you need to have a certain amount of money before these guys will even look at you, because it is a lot of work on their part, and they don't want to deal with people who have trifling amounts of money, because, you know, they have to manage those people as well as their money. You know, there's a lot of talking involved with clients and so on. So some of them do have fairly high minimal capital requirements, so usually 6 figures, sometimes even 7 figures. So obviously that's going to be out of the range of most people here. Some of them don't. You can buy into these funds for much smaller amounts of money, but obviously the smaller that amount of money is, the less personal the service will be, or the less personally it will be tailored towards your situation. So you sort of get what you pay for, basically. All right, and so I'll just say probably the kind of thing like what I'm doing is probably not really going to be what most of you are going to be doing until you have more money, basically. And then the third thing is managing your own money at a very personal level, a very involved level, rather than just using a formula or a system, as I mentioned in the first of the 3 approaches. Now, there are, again, pros and cons to this. The pros are you can get very good returns by doing it yourself, because you can pick up little bargains that big institutions, big funds won't necessarily pick up. So you can discover some things that will give you very good returns, though, of course, many people think they're a lot smarter than they are, and not only do they not get good returns, but they get worse than average returns as a result. Supposedly doctors are notorious for being like this, because they think, well, I'm a really smart guy, I'm a doctor, how hard could this investing thing be? And then, of course, they don't do very well. Another pro is that they basically have very low transaction fees, right? Or only transaction fees, I should say. Low fees, because you're not paying someone else to manage your money. So you know, you can save yourself 1, 2, maybe even more percentage points off your return by not paying those fees to someone else. The cons, however, are legion, and they're very significant cons, actually. The first is sort of the flip side to the first of the pros, that you really need to know what you're doing, because if you don't, you can get very substandard returns. And as I mentioned, a lot of people think they're a lot smarter than they are and find out the hard way that they're not that smart. The second issue, which is a huge topic actually, and I'm only really going to gloss over it here, is the psychological aspects of managing your own money. Because when someone else is managing your money, of course you'll be worried about your money, but it's not really personal in the same way that it is when you're managing your own money. Anyone who runs a business knows this difference between running your own business and being an employee for someone else. You need to be able to sleep at night. You need to be able to make a decision and stick it without second guessing yourself, without getting too greedy, without getting too fearful, without basically being incredibly irrational. And when you handle things yourself, when you're intimately involved in the process, those psychological aspects are greatly magnified. So that's something you need to be aware of. You need to be aware of your own personality and so on, and ask yourself, am I actually suited to this? Do I want this level of stress? Can I handle this stress without acting inappropriately, irrationally, and so on? And it's a huge thing, actually. It's very much overlooked in investing. People tend to just look at the numbers. They don't look at the psychological aspect involved. And it's probably for this reason I would say most people shouldn't manage their own money. And that's a part of why I don't, actually. Because the guy who manages my money, he is extremely level-headed. I can be as well, but I think he's even more level-headed than I am. And there are other reasons that I mentioned before. All right, and the last con for managing your own money is that it is extremely time-consuming. If you're going to buy an individual stock, you don't, get a hot tip off some financial program on TV. You don't get a hot tip off your cousin's brother-in-law, that kind of thing. If you do that, you could very much end up doing your shirt. You need to put in a lot of time in researching a particular company and the industry it's in and so on and so forth. You need to wade through all sorts of financial statements and so on. It's a lot of work, basically. You're talking about dozens of hours, if not hundreds of hours per investment if you're going to really do it seriously. And of course, most people don't have that time. And there's a huge learning curve, obviously. It takes years to get to that point where you can do it really well. The people I know who do this, they say they're still learning a lot, even after 5, 10, 15 years. The investors I know who manage their own, the value investors I know who are managing their own funds personally. So I would probably steer very much away from managing my own money. I don't manage it, and I know a fair bit about this kind of thing. I've read tons and tons about all of this, and ultimately I decided maybe I'm not that smart. Maybe I don't have the right temperament for it. Maybe I just don't have that much interest or time involved. And really, you need to be critical of yourself and say, the biggest negative factor or the biggest potential negative factor in any kind of investing is probably myself. And if I can eliminate that, then that's probably half the battle won. So that's really worth considering, I think. All right, now I would just like to say a couple of other things before I get into my sort of real suggestions here. I want to say something about gold and precious metals, other precious metals, silver and platinum and so on. You'll see if you go into sort of the alternative right or any kind of sort of libertarian or anti-government stuff, people who are sort of concerned about the future of Western civilization, all of this kind of stuff, gold will come up very quickly as a topic of discussion, and why you should be, stacking gold, why you should have don't have money in the bank, don't have stocks, the government's going to come and get you, or, there's going to be financial Armageddon, next Tuesday, all of this kind of stuff. And you'll see all these guys advocating owning gold and silver and so on. They're called stackers. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't own gold per se, but it's a very complex issue, and a lot of people who are involved are very much talking their book. They have a vested interest in getting you to buy gold, usually because they're trying to sell it to you, or they own it and they're trying to get you to buy it or sell it or do something so that they can then make money from what they own. So you have to be very wary of those kinds of guys, and you have to be wary of the fact that gold does have some sort of almost cult-like status with those people. It's almost a religion. It's very hard to talk to a gold bug rationally. They are almost like someone who you know that Y2K thing. Maybe some of you are old enough to remember that. In the lead up to Y2K, there were all these people moving out to the hills and buying water tanks and all this kind of stuff because they were convinced that financial Armageddon was going to happen. It was coming, all of that sort of stuff. And, with a lot of those people, they're not acting rationally. They're hugely driven by fear, sometimes greed, but usually fear. And they've got it into their heads, basically. Now, not everyone who's involved in precious metals is like that, but large numbers of them are. So you have to avoid the cult-like surroundings of precious metal stackers. And sometimes you see some crazy stuff. I saw a YouTube video once. A guy had what was then valued at about $300,000 worth of gold and silver coins and bars at his house. Now, just think about if he got robbed, right? This guy had all of his money in gold and silver at his house because he was convinced that, that was it, right? So sometimes people can do some pretty crazy stuff around gold and silver. And it's a very, very complex issue. It's very hard to know what you're doing. You really need to know what you're doing, and it's very hard to get to that point, I think. I think a lot of people think they know what they're doing, but they sort of pull figures out of the air and so on and so forth. There are very significant pros and cons. There are pros for owning gold, but I don't think amateurs should get involved in precious metals. I think they should generally try to stay away with them. I do own some gold and silver. It's basically in the form of numismatics, which are collectible coins. I bought a whole lot of coins for my son, or in anticipation of the birth of my son. They have these Lunar Series coins from various mints around the world, and I bought some Year of the Goat coins for him and some other coins also to build a little collection for him. I wasn't doing it though because I thought I was going to make a ton of money or to sort of protect against financial Armageddon and all of that kind of stuff. Although I have a reasonable amount of money in those coins, I guess. Although it's only about 1 or 2% of my net worth. But nevertheless, I mean, if the worst came to the worst, I could do something with the gold or silver. I don't intend to. I intend to hang on to that stuff and give it to him when he's older, basically as a little gift or some sort of heirloom type thing. So I do own some silver or gold, and maybe I'll get some more in the future. I don't know, but I have other things I'd rather put my money in at the moment. So either reinvesting it in my businesses or buying other people's businesses, essentially shares. I would be careful about gold and silver, especially anything that's online. There's a saying: if you can't hold it, you don't own it. One of the major pros of owning precious metals is that you actually have them. It's not some paper thing that someone says is worth this, but is it really worth that? Or can you actually get someone to give you something for it? You want to have the physical stuff, the stuff you can actually touch. If it's paper, then it's really no different to having anything else, a bond or the stock or something. You're still trusting someone else. If you are going to get gold and silver, you want the stuff you can hold. All right, so now I'm finally getting to the point of what I would suggest that you do after that long sort of preamble about explanations and reading and all of that kind of stuff. So here's what I suggest. Firstly, you need to be in it for the long term. You need to, whatever you do, you need to be looking at least 5 years, if not 10. If you're going to be in it for shorter than that, then you're going to be very subject to volatility, ups and downs. I would say just don't get involved in making serious investments for less than 5 years, because there's a high chance that you'll be disappointed and then you'll get burnt and you won't ever want to do that kind of thing again. Now, probably the best thing is simply to just follow a system. Find a particular system and that's easy to use. It's not going to involve a lot of time, and basically just do that. Try to get low fees as well, of course. So ETFs, basically. And you can get ETFs for different things, stocks, bonds. You can even get them for gold and so on. I would avoid them for gold. But you can get ETFs for all sorts of different things. I would basically go with that. A handful of different components. So maybe not just in one single thing, but probably not in dozens of different things. Half a dozen, give or take, something like that. Though be aware that there is currently quite a large stock market bubble, and so if you buy in right now, you will probably be disappointed about returns in the future. You'll need to research that whole thing and why there's a bubble and what that means and so on, because that's sort of way beyond what I can discuss in this talk. But just be aware that there is currently a stock bubble. So if you were to buy into it, even using a particular system, you would probably be buying too high at this point. But as I said, that's something you really need to think about a lot more and do your own research on. Now, if it were really me, because I have a particular way of thinking about things, and sometimes that's quite unusual compared to other people, and my personality is a little bit different to other people a lot of the time, I don't tend to get freaked out, actually. If I look at my portfolio and it's down 5% or something, I go, okay, whatever, right? I'm not worried about that. In fact, I say, great, I'll buy some more. But other people get really kind of freaked out, and they get scared, or they get greedy and so on. So I'm a little bit different. But what I would do if it were me, really me, and if you're kind of similar to me in that regard, that you don't need the money right now, or won't in the future, you've got other things going on that are making you money, and you're able to not be so psychologically affected and so on, is I would find a value fund, an actual fund that is run along value investing principles. And I know there are lots of different approaches to investing, and value investing might not be your thing. That's the thing that I do, or the approach that I like, and the thing I sort of know the most about. You might find another fund that follows a different investing philosophy, and that's fine if that works for you. If you can find something that's good, then by all means go with that. But I would probably find a value fund or two and put money in one of those funds. And I had that suggested to me a long time ago when I was first getting into this. And there are lots of value funds available. Some of them require big buy-ins, some of them don't. But just type in value fund. One particular value or one organisation that does this is something called Tweedy Brown. It's a different Brown to the Harry Brown who other people have been talking about. But basically, they have some pretty simple funds, value funds that you can buy into. So I would do that, or I would use Joel Greenblatt's system, the magic formula investing that he talks about at the end of his book, The Little Book That Beats the Market, or The Little Book That Still Beats the Market. I would do something like that. That gets quite good returns, and it is fairly simple. Though, of course, with value investing, there's high volatility, because what you're trying to do is buy for the long term, and you're trying to buy something that is undervalued now. And for a long time, it may go down, it may go up, it may go down, and it can be a bit of a roller coaster ride. So again, if you're not really psychologically suited to that, just do the standard kind of thing, standard portfolio allocation, X% in US shares, X% in international shares, X% in bonds, all of that kind of stuff, some sort of basic system like that. Though I would say get into a value fund, but you probably need to do a lot of research to get to that point where you can comfortably make that decision. That's what I would do, though, essentially. So I hope that has been useful to you, both Jacob Moore and Millennial Woes. If you have additional questions on this topic, please feel free to ask. If anyone else has additional questions, again, you're also welcome to ask those questions. I will make more talks in the future, specifically about some of the things I've discussed here. So I will probably make one on precious metals, the pros and cons of owning precious metals. I will probably make one that goes into value investing a bit more. But nevertheless, if you do have questions about those now, by all means, ask them. So I hope this has been useful to everyone who has listened. Thanks for listening.